Hi, welcome to China Unscripted. I'm your host, Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
I'm Matt Ganejda.
And today we have a very special guest joining us all the way from Texas. Mitch Edwards, cyber threat intelligence analyst for Intel 471. So, Mitch, today you're going to talk to us about the greatest cybersecurity threat to the United States, Russia.
Yeah, it's the Russians.
I knew it. Cold War never ended. But no, seriously, a lot of people, I think, a lot of Americans currently do think it's Russia that is the big, particularly cybersecurity threat. But what do you think about that?
So I spend a good bit of my waking hours arguing with people on social media, pretty much centered around that fact. I studied Chinese in college, and I've spent most of my waking hours after graduating, studying the Chinese cyber threat. And I think there's enough evidence to say, especially in recent history, that while Russia poses a threat, I think China is more of a threat because we're focusing so much on Russia, among other reasons. I mean, the Chinese threat has grown in terms of their tactics and their sophistication, but they become that much more dangerous because, all of America is focused on the Russian witch hunt, as it will.
So you spent years studying this, and what it amounts to is arguing with people on the internet. We're not so different, you and I.
No, we really aren't. I'm just kind of arguing it from a different angle, and, you're doing it a lot better.
I don't know about that. We'll have to...
Well, you're more, Chris, instead of arguing with people, sort of like talking at them.
Oh, you don't know what I do in my free time.
Whatever floats your boat.
So I think a lot of people don't really have a good understanding of the world of hacking. Most people probably just think of that what was that, the name of the movie, that popular cyberpunk movie with Keanu Reeves, Johnny Mnemonic.
Right.
No, Point Break.
Point Break.
Yes, Point Break. That's the hacking movie.
Yeah.
They hack on surfboards.
Oh man.
No, Point Break is where they rob banks wearing masks of dead presidents. Johnny Mnemonic is where he downloads memory into his head.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, he actually does.
All the Keanu Reeves cyber movies just blend together at some point.
I love that we have experts on the show and we go to movies. So this is the movie.
You know what blends in my mind is Keanu Reeves in Much Ado About Nothing,
where he was doing that whole hacking thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the hacking movie. Much Ado About Nothing.
Forsooth, Beatrice.
Yeah.
The good thing is you can't derail a podcast if it starts off the rails.
Yes, this is. We got rid of the rails a long time ago. Other movie it reminds me of, because I got to get it in, the old Batman and Robin movie, where Alfred dies in it, but it's okay because it turns out he downloaded his brain into a computer.
Wait, which one is that?
It's the one with Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze.
Oh,
Highly recommended.
Oh man,
no,
you are showing your age right now, Chris.
It's fresh.
I cannot.
It's still fresh because it's been kept on ice.
I think I stumbled upon it on the TV or something a few months ago, and I couldn't make it more than 15 minutes in.
Really?
It's so
I guess we have different movie
terrible.
It's pretty bad. It's just pretty bad.
It's mostly ice puns from Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yes.
Pretty much, yeah.
Let's kick some ice and talk about Chinese hacking of the United States.
Great segue.
Yes, we're smooth with
So
this.
okay, back to the Keanu Reeves movie about hacking.
Yes. So how should your average person understand hacking? Are we going to be hacked while we're having a podcast right now?
So, yes, almost definitely. I mean, I think you've done enough of your public-facing research and your shows and all of that to land yourself on a list, and I think I've done enough to land myself on one. So, this podcast is a welcome target, but in terms of the average person, I think they need to have a healthy understanding of just kind of what kind of threat there is, and as a threat intelligence analyst, that's kind of what I focus on. Malware analysts are the ones who look at the bad stuff that the bad guys use, and threat intelligence analysts look at the bad guys themselves. So, my focus on the Chinese threat has been less from a tooling and infrastructure perspective than it has been from a, actor-based perspective. So who's actually doing, the badness, on the Chinese side, and how, what can we do about it?
So who are the villains?
if you listen to the book released by, or about the Mandiant story, apparently there are a bunch of 20-year-olds who are wearing leather jackets and, smoking and watching adult film while they're working.
Man, they sound so cool.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. The part that I loved about that story, and as a little bit of background, basically, APT-1 was released back in like 2013, 14. And that was detailing one of the bigger Chinese cyber groups.
That was the name of the Mandiant report.
Right. It was APT-1, which was like kind of a big deal because it was the first time that they had used that kind of naming convention. But it was talking about this big bad cyber group, and fast forward to this year, some guy came out and said that, he was watching the entire thing and, basically Mandiant had hacked the Chinese and was watching them through the webcams. And the funniest part was that he said all of the hackers who were based in Shanghai were wearing leather jackets. And, I don't know how often you guys have gone to Shanghai, but wearing a leather jacket in the middle of the summer in Shanghai is doubtable at the most. But nobody really paid attention to that part. It was just kind of the ridiculousness of the whole story.
Yeah, like the movie Drive, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Well, now you spent some time in Shanghai yourself.
Right. I spent about 3 months in Shanghai.
So did you get in good with Unit 61398?
We had coffee a couple of times, talked about some pretty significant differences between our countries, but we left on good terms. It was a good breakup.
Well, just a little background for people who maybe are not familiar with that. Just a second. I'm checking Unit 61398. I got that off the top of my head. That's really amazing. I'm really amazing. So that was a report by Mandiant in 2013, Mandiant being a cybersecurity analyst firm. And they basically found this unit of hackers called Unit 61398, who were part of the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Communist Party's military. And they had been one of the most severe cybersecurity threats in the world. And this was a pretty serious report that came out. It actually led to this group being a warrant was put out for the arrest, which was one of the first times something like that happened, right?
Right, and it set a precedent that we're still dealing with today. We're trying to decide whether or not that's something we want to continue in the future because of our own hackers facing risk of, having the, that kind of action reciprocate. So
you mean the United States has hackers?
We've got like 3 or 4. It's something we don't talk about much, but it's very few of them, like maybe 3 or 4.
Well, but on a serious note, Mitch, because a lot of people say, well, okay, China's hacking, but so is the U.S. What's the difference?
So that's tough, and that's a lot of the reason why I find myself arguing philosophy over actual technical stuff, because, it has to do with we've got to believe in the American way and the American government doing the right thing. I find it relatively easy to believe that there's at least a comparative good between the two countries. China has made a name for, starving their people into, obedience, while the U.S. has significant problems, especially in recent history, but we're not doing that. So there's at least a comparative good between the two countries, and I believe that if our government is hacking into foreign governments, there's got to be a hopefully ethical and legal, or not legal, but an ethical and a moral reason behind it. Whereas when the Chinese are doing it, it's not going to be for a good reason.
So who are some of the companies or people, or what do the Chinese target when they're hacking?
I think, actually, I want to say it was Hillary Clinton who said it. They're essentially hacking everything that's not nailed down. And I think that was a pretty good way to describe it. We're seeing threats to everything from gaming companies to credit card companies to obviously, government entities, NGOs, and things like that. So, it's really all across the board. And that's why I kind of try to stress that particular aspect, because Russia has relatively specific targeting. I mean, they're across the board as well, but, their targeting is relatively specific to government and infrastructure. And, some pretty big financial institutions as well. But China, I mean, if it's on the internet, they're breaking into it.
So what does China need to be able to do to cross that threshold to be able to hack the things that are nailed down?
I mean, it's really a matter of time, unfortunately. At this point, their sophistication is growing, exponentially. It seems like every month there's a new report that is indicative of, their sophistication growing over time. and it's really only a matter of time until, unfortunately, we have a specific reason to start focusing on China as the, greatest cybersecurity threat over Russia, which is why I'm trying to stress it before that happens.
Well, I think the sad part about the story is how seemingly ill-equipped the United States is to deal with it. In February of 2017, there was a report to the Secretary of Defense called the Task Force on Cyber Deterrence. And it says, the unfortunate reality is that at least for the next decade, the offensive cyber capabilities of our most capable adversaries are likely to far exceed the United States' ability to defend key critical infrastructures. And that report was talking about China and Russia, as well as others. But how do you feel about that? Where do you think the United States is in terms of being able to defend itself?
It's difficult to say. Part of it, there are a whole lot of, and if we had about 12 more hours to talk, I could go more into it, but there are a lot of philosophical discussions going on in the information security industry where we're trying to talk about the inherent kind of advantage that the attacker or the defender has against the other. And, the general idea was because, quite frankly, it sells product. Saying that the attacker constantly has the upper hand is an easy thing to say. There's been a lot of pushback on that recently, but I think in the case of China versus the US, they do have an advantage because they don't have to play by a certain set of rules. The defenders have to play by the rules. China has been notorious in cheating in just about everything geopolitical, whether it be, economic or trade measures, or it be in cyber. It all, is exactly the same. So, in terms of that battle, unfortunately, the one who plays dirty is going to be the one who wins, at least initially. I'm hoping that the U.S. can become more mature in their policy and in their infrastructure defense, but I kind of worry that it's going to end up being too little, too late.
Well, the Communist Party, in its own internal documents, has talked about how it's waging unrestricted warfare against the United States, and cyber, hacking, for instance, is one of the techniques they use. So do you view this as a form of warfare?
It is, and it falls under a specific kind of general kind of warfare called information warfare. And unfortunately, China and Russia have been our biggest adversaries in that specific area. Hacking or cyber warfare falls under this, domain of information warfare, which includes hacking as well as propaganda and, just general kind of human intelligence and, things like that. So all of this kind of falls under this umbrella. And unfortunately, that's kind of the biggest realm where you see the cheater being the winner in that case. If you're willing to play dirty, you're going to have the advantage. And in terms of hacking, you've seen it where they've targeted OPM, which kind of seems like a cheap move. Yeah, right. And, as kind of an aside to that, I was in Shanghai about 3 or 4 streets down from the building where that attack was traced from while it was going on.
And why didn't you do anything?
Well, I knocked on the door and left a microphone inside of a box of donuts, but I think they're gluten-free in that facility. So
that
didn't work.
Gluten-free leather jackets. These guys, I got to meet them. They're great.
Gluten-free diets has long been the adversary of intelligence operations. I mean, you can trace it back to the 80s, but we won't get in that.
It's top secret information.
Right.
Is there anything the average American should be aware of or do about the Chinese cybersecurity threat?
From the on-the-ground perspective, password protect everything. 2-factor authentication is an amazing thing, which basically means after you put in your password, you have another thing that you've got to do. So with most of my accounts, not to give anything away because I guess that would defeat the purpose, but it'll send a text or it'll send an email or something like that where you have to click a link or input a code or something like that. Most people have authentication, 2-factor authentication on something, but at this point you should have it on everything. It just makes people's lives a little bit more difficult.
Such a pain. Can't you just type in 1 2 3 4 5 and just be done with it?
Really, if you're the most secure you could possibly be, you're probably the least convenient. You're taking part in the least convenient practice humanly possible. So if it's less convenient for you, it's a lot less convenient for them.
So mildly inconvenience yourself to massively inconvenience Chinese military hackers.
Right, unless Google just lets them right in the back door, and in that case, it's not your fault.
Yeah. I think I'll stick to password 1. It's too much.
That'll work. It's hiding in plain sight. If you use an obvious password, they're never going
There's
to
a
know.
Sherlock Holmes like that, right?
You're thinking of the Purloined
like
Letter,
that, yeah.
which is actually Auguste Dupin, which was an Edgar Allan Poe story.
Oh. Sherlock Holmes wasn't in that?
He predated Sherlock Holmes. He was the first detective, actually.
Oh, that's why I'm confusing it.
Yeah.
Wow, the world's first detective.
I wish I were cultured.
Or Detective D.
What?
Oh, yeah. I don't actually know when the Detective D novels were written.
Yeah, I was saying
But
the
he's
Qing
kind of
Dynasty
like
came
a
out
judge. Like, is he?
later. But he was also a detective.
Okay.
He was a
Are you
judge.
sure, Chris, or you weren't just reading the fan fiction?
Wait, do you?
Speaking
No,
of
speaking
4chan.
of 4chan. So you don't know the fan fiction story. Okay.
No, I don't think I do.
That's all. Then you don't need to know anything more.
Perfect. I'm sure I'll figure it out.
Well, if you do a search for Chris Chappell and
Harry
fan
Potter
fiction,
fan fiction.
Oh, God. No.
that is the exact response you should have.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know all I need to know. And more than I want to know.
Well, I think Shelley earlier had an interesting question. But what are they doing? Like, are they hacking? Like, stealing intelligence information? Are they stealing intellectual property? What are they going after?
Well, so in that they're hacking into everything that isn't nailed down, they're also stealing everything that isn't nailed down. So you see this in, the fighter jet documents that they stole. You'll see this in other military, technology that they've stolen that I'm sure we haven't seen pictures yet to prove. They've targeted a whole lot of high-tech, military industrial kind of companies like Lockheed Martin and a couple of other contractors. But they're also hacking into gaming companies. And the interesting point with that actually was a report that was released relatively recently in the last couple of weeks, I believe, where they hacked into gaming companies to steal technology that they could use to target activists. So, there's
How do
kind
you
of...
target activists?
Yeah, what
with
kind of
that?
technology is this?
So this is technology, and without going too far into it, it's essentially, it's called a code signing certificate. So with this kind of certificate, you use it to sign what would normally be, like normal software. So these gaming companies would essentially use these certificates to sign their games and say, hey, this game came from us because we use this certificate. This game came from us and we can prove it. So the importance of that comes into when you consider antivirus. Antivirus programs generally will look for certificates like that. And if they find a program that has just been downloaded that has a certificate that's present that says it's a legitimate piece of software, it'll essentially whitelist it, which means it'll ignore it and say, okay, well, this is a good program. Well, the Chinese stole these certificates and were using it to sign malware, which means when they're targeting activists and that program is downloaded, the antivirus that's present on most of these activists, devices is completely ignoring it. So, you had this kind of operation going on at the same time as they were downloading, cryptocurrency miners to make money themselves. And the general idea is that they're doing that to make a little bit of money on the side while they're targeting activists, which is a very Chinese thing to do.
What do you mean? What makes it a very Chinese thing to do?
We've just kind of noticed there's almost this cartoonishness about some of the attacks, where, like, for example, on the cybercrime side, this is, not necessarily, state-sponsored, though there is a little bit of crossover, where on the kind of criminal side, they'll install this malware and they'll start mining cryptocurrency and stuff like that, but they'll leave messages around the computer saying you were hacked by this guy who has this QQ number. And they'll literally leave their calling card. I mean, you'll know exactly who it is, but they'll depend on the fact that nobody's going to do anything about it. So there's kind of like this mischievous side where, they're nation state hackers. Like you saw with, one of the hackers in APT1, his name was Wang Dong, and he went by Ugly Gorilla. And we knew that because he left his name and all of the source code that he wrote, all of the malware that he wrote had his calling card in it. So there's this kind of mischievous side where they're saying, we know that you know what we're doing, but you can't do anything about it. So we're going to keep leaving our calling card just kind of to demoralize us.
Well, it sounds like a Batman villain. You know how, like, the Joker leaves a playing card?
Right. I mean, it sounds like something right out of a cartoon if they weren't stealing, military secrets.
A leather jacket wearing, gluten-free, ugly gorilla leaving his name card everywhere. This is a hit.
We're gonna have a movie.
You can
by
move
the
into
end of
comics.
this, yeah.
I'm telling you,
Yeah.
you can move into comics or a movie.
Yeah. But the scope of this is really stunning. Also, we mentioned the OPM hack earlier, and that affected 21.5 million Americans. And, yeah.
Well, so let me break in there for just one moment.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't mean this to kind of try to sell the, just kind of destruction that was wrought because of this, but it's affecting us still. Mm-hmm. If, you have any experience, dealing with people that have tried to go into the intelligence community in the last couple of years, it's almost impossible. The time that it takes to apply for a clearance has almost doubled or more since the OPM hack, because they've basically been scrambling trying to cover their tracks and make sure that, all of their bases are covered. So it set them back. It was already a long enough process, but it set them back to where, yes, it affected these, 20 million people, but it's still affecting people to this day. Anybody who's trying to apply for a clearance is being affected because of this.
Wow. I forget who it was I was talking to, but they mentioned that one of the effects of that is the Chinese Communist Party was able to see which Americans had what kind of security level clearance, and which people had debts, or which people had these various levers that they could use to make people essentially spy on the United States for the Communist Party. So it definitely was a huge deal.
Right. I mean, they were looking for dirt, and they took all the data that they possibly could, and I'm assuming as soon as they stopped, siphoning data off, they started analyzing it and looking for dirt that they could use.
I was wondering if you could weigh in on this. I remember a guy named Casey Flemings of Black Ops. It's like a securities.
Black Ops Partners was the name of his security firm.
And one thing he said was that Chinese intellectual property theft is costing the U.S. $5 trillion a year when you factor in the net economic value over the course of 10 years. Which is an insanely high number, but what he was saying is where he's getting that information from is he works privately with companies that do not want it to become public that they've been hacked, because it could tank their stock value or it could get the CEO in trouble. How much of this is just going underreported?
I mean, I think the majority of it is underreported, and that's, I would honestly say, it's kind of an iceberg problem where we're all freaking out about, the big breaches that we see in the news, but coming from the perspective that, I've gotten to watch these things happen from, the beginning to the end, basically from initial breach to when the card data is on sale, for example, or when finally the company is forced to, admit that they were breached. I would say that because the policy that the U.S. has is not mature enough to deal with breach notification, I think that the majority of it is underreported. And when you look at intellectual property theft specifically, you don't want to right off the bat admit that your intellectual property was stolen, because the first thing a smart consumer is going to do is wait for the Chinese to start selling it for cheaper. Mm. So there's a lot of advantage to not reporting on it. And, I'm not saying that that's what you should do. It's a bad precedent to set, but I almost understand it from that perspective. I mean, you've got to pay the bills, you got to keep, the food on the table. And when these companies are losing this amount of money already, and just right off the bat with these, intellectual property theft, it's, you've got to kind of understand it from their perspective. And when you think about it also in terms of just business intelligence that they're stealing, they're stealing essentially the internal documents that dictate how they're going to trade, for example, or what their acquisition value is, or something like that. That's something that you really can't tell that you've been hacked. When they find out that kind of internal information from a company, and they use it in the immediate future to negotiate business deals, you may not ever know that information was stolen. So it's a scary thing to really think about, that it's both being underreported and, underinvestigated.
You said earlier that one of the reasons that these Chinese hackers were leaving their name cards was that they were kind of taunting the US like, you can't do anything about it. Is there anything that the companies who have been hacked can do?
There is, to a point. The kind of goal within this kind of realm is to make it as expensive as humanly possible for these hackers to get away with it. So, for example, if I defend my network to the utmost extent and just throw money at it and throw money at it and throw money at it, the hope is that it's going to take them so long to actually infiltrate my network, and it's going to take them so much work that they're either going to give up, or that whatever they gain from that infiltration isn't going to be worth what they spent for it. So that's, from kind of a soft power point of view, that's one way that you can do it. You can make sure that when you do get breached, you make it as expensive as humanly possible for them to actually profit off of it. The other side is a lot more controversial. You can start seeing private companies hacking back against the Chinese. And that's an incredibly, controversial subject right now. I've talked about it at length on both blogs and podcasts, where nobody can really decide where they stand on it. The majority of people don't want to see the Wild West breakout between China and, U.S. private companies. But, again, it's kind of from the perspective of, the defender. You're automatically at a disadvantage if you're playing by the rules and they're not.
What would be the advantages of the private companies hacking back versus the United States government doing something?
Well, so, right now it's difficult to say because we haven't seen it, or at least we don't know that we've seen it. We can obviously assume that the U.S. government is taking offensive measures against the Chinese. I think, everybody is at least, complicitly aware of that. But in terms of private companies, they know they're the first ones to know how their network was breached and what was stolen. And they know the value of it, and they can oftentimes know where the data is stored after it's been stolen. So the idea is to go back, delete all remnants of the data that was stolen, and if you're an extremely pacifist person, you say you pull out, and that is the last that you deal with that network. And that's considered, that's kind of like the really easy to sell version of hacking back. The other idea is you go on the offensive, you walk in, you delete everything that you can find, and you completely destroy their network. And you gather as much intelligence on the way out as you possibly can. That's the other side of it. So you can kind of see why this would be controversial. That's obviously way outside of, a typical private company's area of operations. And most people are only comfortable with a government or military entity doing, offensive, computer network operations. So it's tough.
Speaking of government or military entities, how much of the Chinese hacking of the U.S. is done by the Chinese Communist Party's military versus private actors, and are there really any fully private actors at all?
So that's kind of, I know that obviously anybody, that you guys are dealing with knows pretty, clearly that there's a very, very, very kind of small line between the private and public industries in China. I would kind of argue that it barely exists at all. There's some kind of, private corporation separation, of those corporations and state. But in terms of, the cyber warfare that we're seeing, there's not much separation between the two. I would imagine that the majority of the big hacks that we're hearing about, especially APT1, was traced back to an actual military entity. But a lot of the ones that we're dealing with right now basically sit on that line between private and public. A lot of the hacktivists that I traced, through my research in the last couple of years, they started off as private citizens. They were just individuals. And through their history, basically as hacktivists, hacking for, their country, they were essentially a cyber militia at that point. And they were hired by private companies that ended up being public entities and now are assumably part of, the Chinese PLA. And, that's kind of like an illustration of how, narrow that line is between the two. You've got so much crossover that, I would almost argue that it doesn't exist. The border between the two just doesn't exist.
Well, so for somebody listening who hears that, this is essentially the Chinese military aggressively waging cyber warfare on the United States, what is the problem with private companies hacking back?
you've got to wonder where the line is. Attribution is one of the most difficult and nigh on impossible games in cyber, and that's deciding, once you realize that there's been attack, that's deciding who did it. And, that's long been China's excuse for getting away with this stuff, is they say, well, attribution is so difficult, so you can't honestly say that it was us. They did that after APT-1. And the APT-1 report was a ton of very specific information that you can objectively look at and say there's no arguing against this. But still, China said, they could be messing with the data to make it look like the Chinese. It could be a false flag attack, all of this. So that kind of excuse is why a lot of people don't want private companies taking part in, offensive cyber measures, because what happens if you get it wrong? If you decide that you're going to attack the Chinese PLA and it was actually the Russians, and now you've got, you've added some fuel to the fire that is keeping the conflict between the U.S. and China boiling. We don't want World War III to happen ever, but we definitely don't want it to be Booz Allen Hamilton who starts it.
Also, are there any laws in place currently that would prevent a private company from taking matters into their own hands?
Well, every hacker's favorite law, the CFAA, technically covers that. It covers international hacking as well as, probably a couple of other sub-laws, but that would be the big one. If a private company were caught, hacking back, I would assume that they would be charged under the CFAA and probably trade violations as well, depending on how they use the data. But, that's kind of the blanket law that you can charge anything that touches a computer network with the CFAA.
So this goes back to what you were saying before about how the defenders, if they're playing by the rules, are actually at a disadvantage.
Right, because, everybody wants to defend their network. A lot of people probably want to do so with offensive measures, but nobody wants to be the one who does jail time for it.
And so you mentioned earlier that one of the defenses these private companies do is they try and make it very expensive. They put a lot of money into securing their systems. But then you hear stories about, for example, U.S. defense contractors who fail to even use a password.
Right. And that's been China's kind of go-to, and that's why they're arguably winning, is because they're using the cheapest measures humanly possible to infiltrate these networks. I mean, we've seen reports where they're using 0 days, which are, unreported vulnerabilities in a system. And that just means that they targeted a vulnerability in a technology that we didn't know about yet. And we've seen that happen, and that's considered the most advanced, kind of threat that you could be facing as an entity that uses these, kind of high-tech measures. But a lot of times it's somebody decided to put something on the open internet that they shouldn't have. They decided not to use a password, or they decided to click too many emails. And if they're spending 30 seconds to draft up an email and put a bad thing in it, and we're falling for that, there's no point in blowing, this high-tech, expensive stuff.
Well, we actually have a clip of Admiral Philip Davidson talking about Chinese hacking at a recent Senate Armed Services Committee. Let's play that.
I believe that they are stealing technology in just about every domain and trying to use it to their advantage.
And what's the means that they use to steal that technology?
One of the main concerns that we have, sir, is cyber and penetration of the .com networks, exploiting technology from our defense contractors in some instances.
So why aren't these defense contractors great at cybersecurity as well?
I mean, it's two sides. So, kind of the cybersecurity industry's favorite saying is, hindsight's 2020. A lot of this stuff seems really obvious in hindsight, like why did you not use a password? Yeah. Right. Now that I don't know the particulars behind that situation. I don't feel like that should ever be excusable, but again, hindsight's 2020. With a lot of this stuff, you think, well, they were probably, like, for example, one of the problems that, the industry's been dealing with as a whole, and, the Chinese have exploited it in the past before, is that all of a sudden data is just online, and it's pretty freely accessible, and it's very sensitive data. And, in hindsight, you say, why in the world was that put online? But a lot of times it was a server that was put up to test, and they were trying to make sure that it works, and they didn't have anything on it, so they didn't figure there was any point in, securing it. but they never took it down, and then they started putting sensitive stuff on it. And that seems like an honest mistake, but in hindsight it's like, why did you just put a ton of customer information online?
That reminds me of the big hack of U.S. South Korean a military base recently, where some technician had connected the military base's intranet to the internet, and then hackers were able to get in because that connection was left in place for a year accidentally.
And when you realize that it's a matter of forgetting to unplug one thing, and a lot of times it's a matter of forgetting to type in 1 or 2 letters in a command, that's when you kind of start to realize how easy it is to make a very serious mistake.
So it seems like people are the problem here.
People will always be the problem. Whether it's clicking phishing links or plugging in things that they shouldn't or typing in commands that they shouldn't, people will always be the problem, regardless of how high-tech we get.
So considering the information warfare that the Chinese Communist Party is waging on the United States, how concerned should we be that Chinese leader Xi Jinping has his Made in China 2025 plan, where, amongst other things, China is going to be a tech leader?
Well, you've got to look at what makes that easier. And, cyber warfare falls pretty easily within that framework, where if you're stealing intellectual property, and the turnaround time from stealing the intellectual property to putting it in production is very, very fast for China. We're seeing, like, for example, the jet documents that they stole. They stole the blueprints for, I think it was F-35. Mm-hmm. And the turnaround time to that being a Chinese jet was relatively quick when you consider the technical feasibility of that kind of program. But, when you think about the Made in China 2025 kind of plan, that's made a whole lot easier when you're stealing everything from the U.S.
Yeah.
When you're not having to put near as much work into it, near as much money or an investment, it's very easy to blow up in the tech scene when you don't have to innovate.
Mm-hmm. Do you know about the technology transfer centers they have?
I'm vaguely familiar with that. It's not really in my kind of area of research, though.
Oh. Well, it's something that they have actually written up in their economic plan, so it's very out in the open, but essentially it's where they have, like, this is how they were able to do it so fast with the F-35. It's a streamlined system where Chinese hackers steal some piece of intellectual property. It's given to these technology transfer centers, which then reverse engineer that technology and then give it to Chinese companies.
Right. And we've actually, there's a pretty close parallel to that in a report that I read recently, and I wish I could remember what company put it out because it was very interesting, where they saw, the post-exploitation stage, which means after they've already broken into the network. That is the area that has confused U.S. researchers the most when facing these kind of, breaches, where we're thinking they're stealing intellectual property, but the average hacker is not going to know what to look for. And we're seeing that in a lot of these cases, they'll break into the network and there will be a kind of lull time where we won't see any kind of activity, and then they'll pop back on and immediately know what to steal. And the idea is, what we're assuming is that after they, infiltrate the network, they do some initial reconnaissance, find out what's on the network, and then an expert in whatever field that, the industry that they've breached in, they'll come in and say, this is exactly what we need. And they'll go in, take it all, and, pop right back out.
Leaving their calling card behind.
Right.
Well, so
the ugly gorilla calling card.
Yeah, it's almost like the industries that want to steal the data are almost like outsourcing,
right,
with these hackers, like hiring a hacker to just take the specific things.
It's like, in the case of the Windmill Company, if I were to hack into a Chinese windmill company, I would not know what to steal. I don't know what technical blueprints look like. I don't know how a windmill works. But I do know that I can go call the state-sponsored or state, passed kind of, windmill company, and they'll come over and say, hey, we need this, this, and this in order to build, a windmill for, super cheap and subvert the Chinese market. It's the same exact thing on the Chinese side. They're calling industry experts in, which is another example of how that line is blurred, where, a lot of times we're assuming that the private industry experts are tasking the Chinese military and saying, this is what we need in order to do what we want to do.
China currently is trying to make a lot of breakthroughs in quantum computing. How will that affect anything?
So that's hard. Quantum computing could be the next big breakthrough in just about everything, from cancer research to Alzheimer's research to breaking passwords that can be used to hack into the Pentagon's network. That's the kind of range that we're talking about. It can be used for incredible good. It can be used for, a lot of really cool research purposes, but it can also be used for, essentially just very resource intensive, kind of projects. So cracking passwords that could be 20 or 30 characters long.
Wow.
Or, something like that, that would normally take a normal computer literally millions of years. A quantum computer can do it a lot faster. So that's one relatively simple area of, kind of worry from us. But just from an economic standpoint, the first person that perfects quantum computing is going to be the first person that perfects a lot of things. And that's what we're worried about, AI research in particular.
When the machines figure out they can finally get rid of the people.
Well, I mean, like I said, humans will always be the problem until there are no more humans. So, whoever perfects the AI gets to, buddy up to them a lot quicker than we do.
I'm having second thoughts about putting this podcast on the internet.
I'm giving people ideas now.
Oh, you're right. I'm curious, what is the Trump administration doing that is similar or different to the Obama administration?
So one thing that I particularly disagreed with the Obama administration on was the indictment of the Chinese hackers. I think that that was an incredibly dangerous precedent to set for the reasons that I mentioned before. Indicting another country's hackers, knowing that you're probably not ever going to get your hands on them, sets a precedent for China to do the exact same thing to the U.S. hackers or, maybe just the suspected U.S. hackers further on down the line. And it sets the precedent for, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and everybody else. But it was kind of weird because while I have a problem with that, I also have a problem with Obama being too soft on, the Chinese cyber espionage. His agreement with Xi, I think data shows that it worked. But I kind of think that the resurgence of the Chinese state-sponsored hacking largely is because they know that Obama probably wouldn't have done anything about it if they were caught then.
And just background for people who may not know, the agreement between Obama and Xi Jinping was basically about kind of commercial hacking, that they, on the surface, agreed not to do that. But then what you saw after that was China coming up with a bunch of laws that essentially, they made laws to get around that fact and just required companies going to China to hand over their intellectual property, their source code data, as part of doing business in China or having to work with a Chinese, local Chinese company. So they found ways around that agreement that essentially did the same thing.
Well, and I think, kind of as a disclaimer to what I said, I think that Obama was put in a very tough position with what he was faced with Chinese hacking. Trump in particular, I think he's focusing too much on rhetoric, whereas Obama was a little bit quieter about it. Trump is focusing a lot more on rhetoric, and that can work a lot with the Chinese, but I don't think it's going to work in this particular circumstance. Not necessarily because of state-sponsored attacks, but because of hacktivist attacks.
So where that line between state-backed hackers becomes a bit blurred, you mean?
Right. If the Chinese government says that I can't hack the U.S. at work, then I'll just wait until I get home and do it as part of a patriotic, nationalist Chinese hacker militia or what have you.
So what would you like to see the U.S. government do?
I would like to see a little bit more cultural awareness and honesty. I think we need to be honest with both the American public and with the Chinese that we know that intellectual property theft is part of their strategic plan. And I think we need to have a hard line discussion about whether or not that kind of rhetoric needs to stand. Do we need to allow China to completely ignore what the U.S. is saying and basically depend on another president coming in 4 years and then being able to manipulate the rules after that? Because that's essentially what happened. Obama, was able to stop the, intellectual property theft to a point, but as soon as Trump walked in, it began almost on cue. So China, because they've installed their dictator-in-chief now, they don't have to worry about the 4-year turnover rate.
Hey, he's elected by
the
National People's Congress.
He's elected by the people he appointed, which is very convenient for him. But I think we need to start being more honest about the kind of strategic goals that China has. That needs to be something on the forefront of people's minds, when we're dealing with the Chinese, is that it's their strategic goal to subvert our economy and to subvert our culture.
It is warfare.
And, right, it is warfare. And, it doesn't have to be missiles pointed in any direction. It can be a much more cold and quiet form of warfare, but it is warfare.
Well, I've certainly been encouraged by, particularly in the past couple of months, the U.S. intelligence services speaking out very clearly about the threat the Chinese Communist Party poses. The CIA recently going so far to say that we're in another Cold War.
And I think that the Cold War kind of, vocabulary is a good one to push, but we need to be careful with it because it's a different kind of Cold War. This isn't the Cold War where, we've got missiles pointed in two different directions. This is the kind of Cold War where it's hot, but the average person doesn't know that. In terms of, cyber warfare, it's ongoing. We've got offensive operations and defensive operations on both sides. Everybody, acknowledges that. And that makes it a hot war. It's only cold because the average person doesn't ever see the effects of it.
Yeah.
And that's good. Hopefully it will stay cold to the average, person, and, people in the industry can deal with it on their own as a hot war. But, we just kind of need to be careful because, it sounds really sexy to say that we're in another Cold War, but it's a very different kind of war that we're fighting right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess there's a very different psychological impact when you're having American citizens building bomb shelters in their backyard versus what do you do now?
Well, we built bomb shelters during the Cold War, but we can't password protect our contractors.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to say we're in the Cold War. It's complicated.
Oh, why does it have to be complicated?
Oh, tell me about it. I wish it could all be simple, like when we had nukes pointing our direction.
Ah, the good old
days. Yeah.
The good old days. If I could go back
Well, knowing
to before I was born.
knowing that it doesn't end in global nuclear annihilation, it does seem simpler.
Well, we hope.
Well, I guess that card is still on the table.
Right. And the idea of it being a Cold War in cyber doesn't mean it couldn't go cold or hot in any other, direction. That's just kind of one medium that we're fighting over right now and that we hope doesn't spill over into others.
It's too bad China controls Hollywood. Otherwise, there'd be some great movies about this.
Oh, there'd be some amazing movies. Transformers could have been an awesome movie if, China didn't take control of it.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
Hollywood phenomena that is, Transformers movies.
Yeah, they're robots, but they're in disguise. They're more than meet the eye.
Are we talking about Shia LaBeouf or the actual Transformers? I can't tell which robot you're talking about.
I think with Shia LaBeouf, he's exactly what meets the eye.
Yeah. You look at him and you're like, yep, that's definitely Shia LaBeouf.
This is incredibly off topic, but have you heard that song? I think it's called "Actual Cannibal" Shia LaBeouf.
Yes,
That's
and it's
amazing.
hysterical. It's
It's
the only good thing to happen from Shia LaBeouf.
Especially his bizarre Citizen Kane style clap at the end.
Yeah, and it's just I almost feel like he had more of a hand in that movie than people are led on.
Yeah.
But it was an artistic masterpiece.
Did you hear how? Oh, I'm probably not going to explain the story well, but he was how did he do it? Oh, this is going to be a bad story. I'll probably cut it, but it's an interesting story that I'll just tell you. He was making these kind of videos, antagonizing certain people. I don't really know, but the point is he would hoist up a flag somewhere, and people would come and take it down. And it got to the point where he was he made one of these videos in a field in the middle of nowhere, with no identifying features around him, and he put up some flag or something. This is really not a well-told story, but the point is, these people on the internet, watch the video. It was kind of a partly cloudy night, so you could see this, some stars in the sky, and people triangulated based on that where he was. And
oh, I love people.
So that's a cool story that you should probably look up.
Can we get those people to work on cybersecurity?
Yeah. Why?
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Just geolocate all of the hackers so we can't do anything about it still because diplomatic immunity and all of that fun stuff. But, it'd be cool.
We need to harness the power of 4chan.
No,
Oh,
no,
God,
no,
let's
no,
not.
no, no,
Let's
no,
not.
no,
That-
no,
No one man should have all that
is
power.
like nuclear energy. It's like it's too much power for humans to have. It'll go wrong.
Yeah, and then you end up with radiation sickness afterwards.
And now we're into Fallout, the game series.
Though you might end up president if you harness the power of 4chan.
Hey,
I don't think he specifically tried to harness the power.
it's like the Ark of the Covenant.
I mean,
I
I'm not
think-
sure he knows what 4chan
Yeah.
is.
That quote's going to stick with me. 4chan is like the Ark of the Covenant.
Wait,
That's
whose
perfect.
face is melting in the scenario,
All
though?
of ours.
Because
Just close your
in the
eyes.
original,
Oh,
it was the
man.
Nazis' faces that melted. But if 4chan is the Covenant,
Or is 4chan the Nazis?
Oh man, this analogy is eating itself.
We're diving
No, so
deep.
the lesson is like if you want to not have your face melted by 4chan, you have to do what Indiana Jones did and just close your eyes and not pay any attention to it.
Right. Just don't pay attention to 4chan. If you get any lesson from this podcast about Chinese cybersecurity, know that you shouldn't pay
Unless
attention to 4chan.
we have a lot of fans on 4chan, in which case I love you. Help us take over the world.
Right.
Was that like the perfect ending to this podcast?
That was probably the best segue that you could possibly have had.
And on that note, well, thank you again for joining us, Mitch. If people want to learn more about you and what you're doing, what can they do?
So this sounds like a joke, but the vast majority of information security research is done on Twitter. So you can follow me on Twitter at Viking_sec, SEC. Don't ask. There's a story there, but you probably don't want to spend too much time asking. You can also follow me on Medium, which is a blogging platform. My username on Medium is the CTIGUY, the CTI guy. So you can follow me on either of those. I do a podcast on Twitch as well. Same username is on Twitter, Viking_sec. So I do that every week, and you can follow my podcast there as well.
Hey, Mitch, what's the Viking story?
The Vikings story is I really liked the TV show Vikings and got entirely too into it, and then named my dog after one of the characters. So now I'm Viking everything.
Which character, though?
Bjorn.
Wait, which one was Bjorn?
Bjorn was Ragnar's son, Bjorn Ironsides.
Ah, right, okay. I watched the first couple seasons of that.
It's just brutal.
On the so-called History Channel.
The history/drama channel.
Yeah.
/ aliens.
Yeah, and aliens.
The only scene of that show I've seen, it's like I think somebody's about to like have his head chopped off at like an executioner thing, and the guy's just like ask somebody, please hold my beard so it doesn't.
Yeah, hold
like,
my hair. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
like
that
as
was
the
great.
axe is coming down, he pulls back, and so the guy gets his hands chopped off.
It's just a
Dead.
brutal show.
and
And
the
they
guy-
just all start, like, the Viking starts laughing. The whole crowd is, like, throwing up in the background. Oh, it was amazing. But you just
Shelley
learned a lot about my
is in
personality.
horror right now. You should see the look on her face. Well,
They
that's-
can't because it's a podcast.
Thank goodness. That sounded kind of insulting.
Ooh, yeah, it did, didn't it?
I did not mean it that way. So great. Be sure to check those things out. And thanks for listening to China Unscripted. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
I'm Matt Gnezda.
See you next time. Talk to you next time. I got to get that right.